In Matthew, the 24th chapter, and verses 9 through verse 13, Jesus says, "But then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved." These events that are in this text were literally fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. We went back last week and we looked, really starting with the latter part of chapter 23. You have the basis for chapter 24 in that here's, for example, in chapter 23 and verse 34, that God had sent unto Israel, to the Jews, prophets, wise men, scribes, and they had crucified, killed, they had rejected them. And so he says, your house in verse 38 of chapter 23, your house is left desolate. And so when he leaves, his apostles come to him and he tells them, see all these buildings and all these things. There's not going to be one stone left upon another. And that's the first part of chapter 24. So their question is, when shall these things be? In other words, when is it that one stone is not going to be left upon another? What are going to be the signs that this is going to take place? And the end of the world. And so Jesus then begins really in verse 4 of chapter 24 and continues on through verse 35, setting forth, here's the signs that are going to be preceding and that are going to be associated with the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus and the Roman armies in AD 70. In verse 36, there's a great contrast, but of that day. And so he changes the subject from the destruction of Jerusalem to the end of the world. This that we just read a moment ago in verses 9 through verse 13 is dealing thus with that period of time prior to the destruction of Jerusalem and some of the events which would take place there. But even though it applies specifically to them, the principles and there's some practical applications that we can use in relationship to us. And we should not forget those things. The trials which tested their faith, likewise many times will test us. And so there's principles that we can find. And that one that overcomes the world, well, John says, here's the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. And so those principles that they needed, we need as well. The first thing that we noted is that Jesus teaches the possibility of apostasy. That it is possible for a Christian to so sin as to lose their soul in an eternity in hell. Many scriptures emphasize the truthfulness of that. 1 Corinthians 10, 12, Galatians 5, 4, 2 Peter 2, and verse 20. All of the passages that deal with the warnings that are given in the Bible in regards to Christians, the encouragement to faithfulness, all of those emphasize the possibility of apostasy. But Jesus doesn't only give the fact that man or that Christians can apostatize. In this section, he gives some reasons for that desertion as well. The first of those being false doctrine. If you look at our text in verse 4 of Matthew 24, Jesus says, "Take heed that no man deceive you." There's going to be deceivers out there. And because they're deceiving, their false doctrine, well, verse 11, "Many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many." And again in verse 24, "There shall arise false Christ and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, that they shall deceive the very elect." False doctrines, false teachers are abundant today, both outside of the Lord's church, but also in the Lord's church. And thus, the warnings that Christ was giving to them during that period prior to the destruction of Jerusalem serve for us as well. We need to be rooted and grounded in the truth, lest we be deceived, lest we be led astray. But there's a second thing, and that is persecution. In verses 9 and verse 10, he says, "Then shall they deliver you to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another." See, here's affliction. They're going to be delivering you up to be afflicted. That's persecution. They're going to kill some of you. That's persecution. You're going to be hated of all nations because of me. That's persecution. Paul would tell Timothy in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12 that, "Yea, all that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." In other words, if you're living the Christian life, persecution is going to come. It's not that you might be persecuted, or there's a possibility of persecution if you're living the Christian life. No, it is a natural result of living the Christian life. If you're living the Christian life, if you're living godly in Christ Jesus, then this is the result. You shall suffer persecution. In the parable of the sower, Matthew the 13th chapter, in verses 20 and 21, as Jesus is explaining this parable to the apostles, "But he that received the seed in the stony place, the same is he that heareth the word, and anon with joy receiveth it, yet hath no root in himself, endureth for a little while, or for a while, but for when tribulation or persecution ariseth because of the word, by and by he is offended." So here's this individual. He receives the word with joy. And that indicates this is an individual who has become a Christian. But as always is the case, persecution's going to come. He is not grounded. He's not rooted in the faith. And so he lasts for a little while, but then that tribulation, that persecution that arises because he's a Christian, because of the word, and he's offended. What is that? He stumbles and falls. His faith, or he loses his faith as a result of the persecution, the tribulation that's going to come. In our society today, here in the United States, at least at this point in time, we don't suffer physical persecution. Now, I'm not saying that it never has taken place. I'm not saying that it will not take place, because I believe the direction of the United States is going, it will in the future take place. I'm not saying other places in the world it is not taking place. It is in places in the world. There is physical persecution that many are having to deal with. But generally speaking, for us today here in the United States, physical persecution is not the problem. You're not going to be beat. You're not going to be arrested. You're not going to be stoned. You're not going to receive physical persecution because of being a Christian, because of your Christian life. But that's not the only type of persecution that people face. In 1 Peter, the 4th chapter, here's Christians. They had left the ways of the world. They had come out from the world. They are now living a faithful Christian life. And he says concerning those individuals that they're no longer associated with, they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you. And so here's this individual. He leaves that old man of sin and worldliness and evil, and he becomes a Christian. His life is now changed, and those people that he used to associate with him, they think he's an oddball now. They think he's strange because he's not doing the things that he used to do. He's not living the way that he used to live. And so what? They begin speaking evil of that individual. There's persecution. It is a speaking. It is a verbal form of persecution, not a physical persecution. But it's still a persecution, even though it's not physical. In fact, earlier in this same book, in 1 Peter 1, verses 6 and verse 7, he talks about wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold temptation, that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto the praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. Here's persecution that he's talking about. Heaviness. Why? Because of manifold temptations, of various forms of temptation. The trial of your faith. In other words, here's individuals who are outside of Christ persecuting you because of the faith. But that faith is more precious than gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire. The trial with fire there, going back to the persecution that's taking place. They were literally going to be going through a physical persecution, a fiery persecution. They needed to remain faithful. But the very fact that here's individuals speaking evil of you, physical persecution even, the whole purpose is they think it's strange that you're not running with them to that same excess of riot. And so they're going to speak evil of you to get you back to running in the same excess of riot that they were running in. To doing the same thing that you used to do. The same being, the same person that you used to be. Paul would write in 2 Corinthians 12th chapter and verse 10, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. I'll take pleasure. Yes, here's the infirmities, the reproaches, necessities, persecutions, distresses, all of those things that the Christian has to face because he is a Christian, because he's living that Christian life. And he says, I'll take pleasure in those things. Now then, does anyone think that those actual things were pleasant? That they were pleasurable? No, but Paul knew the good that they did. When I am weak, then I'll be strong. He knew that those things would lead to strength, but it could also turn the other way from individuals, and that is lead to them falling away. A strong faith in that one who works all to our good is needed thus. Romans 8 and verse 28, Paul says, we know that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them who are called according to His purpose. While we may not understand something that we are going through, Let's face it. For example, Paul again. He didn't understand the thorn in the flesh. Prayed 3 times for its removal. Whatever that thorn was, we don't know. But whatever it was, here he is praying for its removal. And basically God says, no. My grace is sufficient for you. But the fact is, Paul had faith in God. And realized that I may not understand it, but it will be for good. All things work together for good. Not that all things are themselves good. Thorn in the flesh, I doubt that Paul ever thought that it was good. But yet it worked to his goodness. And so persecutions, the ridicule, the ostracism that this world will give and do to those who are Christians is certainly a reason that people apostatize. But then also the prevalence of sin is a reason that Jesus gives for people apostatizing. Notice in our text again in Matthew 24 verse 12, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Here is a period of time in which the Jews, being surrounded by Titus and the Roman armies, and the reason that they were surrounded by Titus and the Roman armies was because of sin, because they had turned away from God and rejected God and finally rejected His Son. And now then God is going to destroy the city. But the wickedness, the iniquity, the sin that is in that city grew more and more. It continued to get worse. And because of that, Jesus says, the love that many have toward God waxes cold. It decreases, and we don't do what we need to do. We don't have that love for God that we should. Paul wrote about this same problem in 2 Timothy 3, in verses 1 through verse 4, when he says, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come." In other words, there's going to be troublesome times, perilous times. Last days, that day is between the establishment of the church in Acts the 2nd chapter to the time Christ comes again in the future, whenever that is. And then he mentions, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parent, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, trady, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. Just a list, as you read through that list of sins, sounds like, to a great extent, our society, doesn't it? If you look at our world, the world that we live in today, this does express it. All of those things definitely apply to the situation we live in today. We live in the midst of broken homes, and the hatred that causes those broken homes, the hatred that results from those broken homes, the divorce evil. In order to avoid the divorce problem, so many now are just living without the benefit of marriage, just shacking up together. Fornication, adultery is so widespread that it's not even considered wrong anymore by so many of our society. Drunkenness, alcoholism. If you don't drink, something's wrong with you nowadays. At least to the majority of people. Talk about going back into the times of prohibition and bringing back prohibition and see how people respond. Because you got to be joking. That didn't work then. Well, go back and look at some of the statistics and studies. See if it didn't. But that doesn't matter. You tell a lie often enough, people think it's the truth. Delinquency, wantonness, the irreverence that we see, both from the standpoint of our nation, of the parents within the home and the authority that is found therein, at schools, and yes, those influencing the attitudes in the church as well, and the respect that should be found there. The problem is, we see all of these things in our society, and we could just go on and on listing things. And a lot of times, Christians start throwing up their hands and saying, what's the use? What good is it? That's the situation that Jesus was dealing with in Matthew 24. Here's the prevalence of sin in Jerusalem, and because of that, many Christians will just simply give up. And we see it in our society and in the church today as well. We just give up because of the prevalence of sin. Sin is so around us, and we're so associated with people who are in sin and wickedness that we just finally, I'm so tired of it, I'm just going to stop. And our love for God and love for righteousness starts waxing cold. And thus, Jesus pleads for endurance. Look again at the end of that text that we were reading in Matthew 24 and verse 13. But he that endureth to the end shall be saved. Now, there's no doubt that in this passage and in this context, Jesus is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. That one who endures to the end there having reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, shall be saved. And the aspect of salvation in this verse is dealing with saved from that destruction. Because Jesus is going to set forth those signs that precede that destruction, and he's going to tell them that when you see this event taking place, flee to the hills and the mountains. And we know that there were no Christians that died in the destruction of Jerusalem because they saw the signs that Jesus set forth, and they escaped at that time when Jesus told them to escape. And so while this specifically has reference to that time frame, and that saved no doubt has reference to a physical salvation from that destruction of Jerusalem, yet the spiritual application is there as well. And many of the scriptures that we see within the Bible certainly emphasize the same need for a spiritual endurance. I just mention a couple. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 58. And you remember one of those things that we talked about, in fact last week, the false teachers that were there. If you go back into 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's dealing specifically with false teachers. Because the false teachers at Corinth had come along and said, there's not going to be a bodily resurrection. And so Paul is showing, if that be the case, for example, then Christ could not have been raised from the dead. Was Jesus bodily raised from the dead? Well, if he was, he became the first fruits, Paul says, which is a guarantee that others will also be raised from the dead. But it is a bodily resurrection that he was talking about. And then at the end, he shows how that this mortal must put on immortality. This corruptible must put on incorruption. And then he comes to the end of this entire section dealing with false teachers, and he says, therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. In other words, you endure. What about these false teachers? Well, yes, there's a prevalence of false teachers, but you endure. You keep on. You continue in the work. You abound in that work of the Lord. You remain steadfast. You remain unmovable. Don't be moved by the false teachers. Don't be moved by persecution. Don't be moved by the prevalence of sin. You continue to abound in the work of the Lord. And he gives the reason: your work is not in vain. In other words, that resurrection, that bodily resurrection that is proven fact by the fact of the resurrection, bodily resurrection of Jesus. And there's going to be an eternity that comes. And so you continue on. And that labor is not in vain. It's not worthless. It is of value. In Revelation, the 2nd chapter and verse 10, Jesus says, to fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. There's the suffering that he's dealing with there from persecution here. And it's the type of persecution that the devil, not physically, but representatively through the devil's work, is going to cast some of you into prison. That's physical prison. You're going to go to jail because of your Christianity, that you may be tried. And during that period of time, that tribulation, 10 days, he says. 10 days, it's not literal, it's a figurative. 10 stands for something, a period of time. A short period of time in this case. But it is a completed period of time. You're going to have tribulation during those days. What do you need to do? Remain faithful. Endure. And he says, unto death. In this case, the death there, meaning if you are being put to death because of your Christianity. If they say you renounce Christ or die, you go ahead and die. Why? Because you remain faithful. That's why. In our text, the duration of that endurance is stressed, even as it is here, to the end. Be thou faithful unto death. That's to the end. That's even if it causes you to die. In our text there in Matthew 24, you do so. He that endureth unto the end shall be saved. If we want salvation, we can't quit. We cannot stop. We have to endure to the end of our life. And even if that endurance, even if that faithfulness to God causes us to be put to death, you endure. You continue on in faithfulness to God. Now then, the result of that endurance, in our text again, he that endureth to the end shall be saved. In Romans the 8th chapter and verse 18, Paul would say, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. Here's this present time, the sufferings that we endure, the problems, the trials, the tribulation, yes, and all of the abounding evil that is around us. the prevalence of sin in that situation, the persecutions, all of these things, this world, the sufferings of this present time, not worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed. There's going to be an eternal home with God in heaven. To that one that endures to the end, he shall be saved. In 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, and verse 17, Paul says, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." And he says, "While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen." What is it? This world. These things are but for a moment. You know, we're here for a few years, and then we pass away. Our life here upon this earth is described by James as a vapor that appears for a little time, then vanishes away. We're here but for a moment. And thus, those afflictions that we endure in this moment, this short period of time, works for a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. That eternal weight of glory is that heaven's home that he describes in chapter 5. That's what's waiting for that one who endures to the end. But if we apostatize, if we allow these things in the world to stop us from that Christian life, then that glory will not be revealed in us. And we will be lost in that eternal punishment. If you've never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ this morning, we would encourage you to obey, to do what God says in obedience to Him. If you have obeyed the truth, but you haven't continued in that faithfulness, you haven't endured during your lifetime, and you need to come back and you need to repent and be restored to faithfulness to God, and think of that eternal glory that shall be revealed if you return and you're faithful to God. And those who are been faithful to God continue to endure because of the glory that shall be revealed. So if you need to come, we would encourage you to do so as we stand and sing the invitation song.